Hi there. My name is Erica Lafort, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the digital transformation of the WJ5. First off, though, I want to thank Don and Vinny and Sam and the Riverside Insights team for inviting me here to present today. The lineup for this conference is really impressive, and so I just feel really honored to be included on the roster. Before I get started, though, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my background and my relationship to the WJ5. So I've been working in test development for my entire career. My formal training is in educational psychology with a focus in educational measurement. So as a psychometrician, my research interests focus on the application of the IRT measurement models for test development, validation, and score interpretation. Over my career in test development, I've had the opportunity to work with the WJ authors on 3 different editions of the battery, the WJ3, 4, and now the 5. My roles on these batteries have ranged from editorial to development to research. On the WJ5, I've been serving as an independent contractor to Riverside Insights. So in addition to working on the psychometric and research aspects of the battery and co-authoring the WJ5 technical manual, I also helped the Riverside team with the aspects of the digital platform design that relate to construct validity. Here's just a high-level outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. For those of you who have attended some WJ5 webinars already, some of what I'm going to be talking about will be familiar. However, since we have 2 hours today, I'm going to be going into more detail about some of these topics than you may have seen before. And for those of you who are really excited about seeing the new platform in action, in the second hour, I'm going to be showing some videos where you'll be able to see firsthand what it's actually like to administer the WJ5. But most of our time is going to be spent, just taking a peek under the hood at what went into the planning and the execution of the digital version. So first I'll be reviewing some of the challenges with administering paper tests like the WJ4. Then I'm going to give you a little context for the decision to go digital with the WJ5. Next, I'll spend some time talking about some of the decisions that went into the new platform design, and I'll show you how those designs were implemented in some quick video examples. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions. So in thinking about how to structure this session, rather than just talking about the features of the digital platform, I really wanted to try to give you a perspective on the thought and all the decision making that went into creating it. It's really been a huge effort by the entire team at Riverside, and I think it's something I'm really excited to share and talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. So I'm guessing that most of you here today are very familiar with what it's like to administer tests like the WJ5 in the traditional paper and pencil format. But I first just want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the challenges that come along with traditional administration, because I think it provides some really nice context for why the WJ5 is a digital product today. First and foremost, I think nobody here can disagree that a major challenge of traditional testing is just the sheer quantity of testing materials. So, that stereotype of a school psychologist lugging around a suitcase full of materials really exists for a reason. This here on this slide, you just see a portion of the WJ4, but if you were to order and administer the entire battery, you would have something like 7 test books and 3 manuals, the technical manual, you'd have audio recording. You'd also need to have a stopwatch and pencils and a device for playing the audio recordings. And then, of course, after you're done testing, you're still going to need your computer to produce your score report. So paper testing just requires a lot of stuff. And because of its sheer size, that's really especially true for the WJ4. Administering tests in paper is also just really time consuming. So the plot that you see here is the average testing times in minutes for each of the tests that was administered in the WJ4 norming study. So for example, according to this plot, the mean testing times from the WJ4 norming, if you were to administer, so for example, the entire GIA cluster would take 75 minutes. If you were to administer the tests in the brief achievement cluster, it would take 24 minutes. And the times that you see here are really just the administration time. They don't take into account, in practice, the time that you would also spend entering the scores into the platform, generating reports, getting your materials all organized on the table. There's just a lot of steps involved with administering tests in paper. And a lot of your time is actually spent shuffling materials around, turning to the right page, making sure you have your audio equipment set up. It just takes a lot of time. And with so many testing professionals carrying such heavy caseloads, time is really a luxury that people can't afford to waste. Administering standardized tests like the WJ4 isn't easy. In fact, it requires a lot of multitasking. So if you think about all the things you have to do in the course of administering a test, sometimes you're reading instructions silently, sometimes you're reading them out loud. You have to listen to what the examinee is saying, and then you have to quickly make a decision about how to score their response or determine if you have to give them a query to ask for more information before you assign the score. If you're administering a test with audio recorded stimuli, you have to manage the recording device. You have to make sure you're playing the correct track, that you're cueing forward or backward to the correct item on your audio. You have to follow all of the instructions for turning the page and for starting and stopping the timer or the stopwatch. You have to monitor the basal and ceiling rules to make sure you're giving enough items. And then, of course, you have your test by complete page rules that you have to make sure you're following those correctly. And this is all just a typical administration. Think about if you're testing a younger child or someone who has significant behavioral or learning challenges, you're going to have to do all of that same stuff, but also maintain the examinee's focus and attention. So it's just a lot. And I think even really experienced examiners find it difficult to administer the tests exactly according to the standardized instructions. With all the details you have to remember when you're administering the test, it's really, really easy to make administration mistakes. There's actually been quite a bit of research about this. It's very interesting. So for example, a recent study by Lockwood and colleagues found that of 26 protocols that they reviewed these were graduate trainees in school psychology, these were WJ4 achievement protocols, they found that every single one of those protocols contained somewhere between 8 and 150 errors. So that's a lot of errors. Many of these weren't minor errors either. They were big things like starting with the wrong item, not giving enough items, scoring items wrong, errors in raw score calculation, and even making errors typing the numbers into the scoring software from the test record. So maybe it was right when you calculated it, but you entered it into the scoring platform incorrectly. So all of these kinds of things can impact the examinee's results and, of course, the interpretations from those scores. And unfortunately, that study is not unique. Other prior studies have noted very similar rates of errors on WJ administrations among graduate students. So there was another study by Ramus and colleagues, and they were looking at WJ3 COG protocols, and they found errors on all 108 test records that they reviewed. There was another study done. This was really interesting. There was a group of my colleagues actually at Riverside who did a study in 2016. This is something that they had presented at NASP that year. They looked at 1,000 protocols from the WJ4 norming study, and they found that there were errors on 28%. So 1/4 of the protocols had at least one error. And what's kind of interesting about this study is that they separately looked at professionals who had been in the field. These are people like school psychologists and diagnosticians and special education teachers, people who were testing professionals in their jobs, versus people who were paraprofessionals who had just been trained to administer the WJ specifically for the norming study. And what they found was that the professionals actually had made more mistakes than the paraprofessionals who had, much less training and much less experience. And so that was a really interesting finding. And I think the hypothesis there is that, the more you give these tests, the more you're in the field, you might get a sense of confidence. You've been giving them for a long time. Maybe you just start skimming the materials and skimming the instructions and you're not reading verbatim anymore. Maybe you just have, come upon some bad habits that you've done over and over. And those habits have now become permanent to the point where, you're just making these regular errors without even realizing it. So in addition to the examples that I've provided here, other studies have looked at other batteries and really found similar results. So again, this is not unique to WJ. This is really just a problem with the standardized administration of these tests, that it has to be so exact and there's so many materials and so many instructions. It's just really difficult to do. And of course, again, we go back to the heavy caseloads, the limited testing time, and we potentially throw in some poor habits that maybe have formed over years. And it's clear that examiner errors just really have the potential to drastically impact the student's results, which of course can then have cascading negative impacts for the student. Anyway, now that I've talked about some of the biggest challenges with traditional paper-based testing, I want to go ahead and introduce you to the digital WJ5 and talk about how it addresses some of these challenges. Digital WJ5. So this version is going to take all of those paper materials that we talked about, and it's going to streamline it all and integrate it all so that the only physical materials you're going to need are a laptop for yourself, you're going to need an iPad for your examinee or student, and then you're going to need a paper response booklet for just a handful of the achievement tests. So this version, I think, is going to save you a lot of time. It's going to simplify a lot of the administration tasks. And of course, it's going to minimize or greatly reduce the number of errors that are made during administration. Before I dive into talking more about the new digital platform and all of the design features, I just want to give you a brief history of how it actually came to be. So you might actually be surprised to know that, or to hear, that prior to 2020, the WJ5 was never intended to be a digital product. It was going to be a paper product, just like it always has been. So it was going to have your paper test book easel, but then the plan was to replace the traditional test record form with what we called a digital test record, or a DTR. And so with a DTR, the examiner would administer the tests as they always have from a test book, but they would enter the item level scores into the DTR on their laptop during the administration. So for those of you who are familiar with the WMLS3, there's a DTR option. But basically, the DTR guides the examiner through the administration, and it ensures that you're meeting the stopping rules and achieving a basal and a ceiling and all of that. It also does all of the raw score calculations. So it really removes the need for the paper test record, but it still maintains the paper test booklet. So you were still going to have that paper test book easel that you've always had. And so at the beginning of 2020, when we were first starting this project, we had actually developed several new tests, and we were piloting them in paper and pencil with the plan that, that we would proceed with paper administration for the entire WJ5 product. But as we all know, everything changed in March 2020. So the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and then the shutdowns. And of course, like everybody else, we on the WJ5 project team at first thought that the shutdowns were going to be temporary and that we could just absorb some of our lost time. We were in the middle of some pilot testing, and we thought, well, we can just absorb some of that time in the overall schedule, and we'll get back to get back to things as normal in a few weeks. We didn't think it was going to be a big deal as far as our overall project schedule. But as those weeks started to turn into months, we realized that there was really no way we were going to be launching an in-person norming study, which we had planned to do in the fall of 2020. So in the meantime, during the spring of 2020, much of the effort and focus among the Riverside clinical team was really going into supporting customers who were out there trying to do evaluations. Their schools were shut down. They were trying to conduct their evaluations remotely. And so a lot of effort was going into just supporting existing customers and helping them. And so through all of that, I think the realization was that, the traditional paper pencil is really not as adaptable into Zoom or telehealth platforms. So, other publishers who had instruments that were already in digital, I think were able to integrate those instruments much more easily into these telehealth platforms and some of the Zoom testing that was going on at the time. And so Riverside was really scrambling to assemble guidance documents and to provide people with best practice advice on how to give these tests remotely. So not that there was any real best practice happening at that point, of course, during the pandemic, but certainly trying to give people reasonable guidance for how they could administer these tests remotely. So by the time that the dust had settled, and this was probably midsummer 2020, and we had all just sort of accepted that social distancing and shutdowns were not going away anytime soon, at that point there were two, I think, big reckonings among the WJ5 project team. So first, we knew that there was no way that we were going to be launching this national norming study that fall. And so that forced delay kind of allowed the team some time to breathe and really reassess the plan for the WJ5. Second, it had also become clear since the pandemic began that, like I said, some of these other publishers really had tools that were already digital, and that those were, much more easily incorporated into some of the social distancing and remote testing. So, for example, if you have a test that's already digital, you've already got the ability to display that stimulus material on screen, right? You're not having to use a separate document camera to then show the stimulus to the examinee in a separate view of the Zoom call or whatever. So, it's just much more complicated to try to do that kind of testing with paper materials. So once the fog had cleared and we were sort of coming out of the initial pandemic shutdowns, Riverside really had some new clarity about the best direction for the WJ5. So that summer, the kind of on a dime, the decision was made that the WJ5 is going to go fully digital. And sort of looking at the landscape of the clinical testing market in 2020, just kind of seeing what was going on, in the market as a whole. Here are some observations that the WJ5 team made. So first, the digital administration of clinical tests wasn't a new idea, right? So the Pearson Q Interactive platform had already been around for several years by that time. I think it was probably at least 6 or 7 years. And other clinical test publishers were also beginning to migrate their tests onto new digital platforms. So a sizable body of literature was already starting to exist that supported the equivalency of digital and paper versions of some of these other clinical products. Second, there were companies that were doing these remote testing platforms. So Presence Learning is an example. Companies that were integrating paper materials into remote and web-based test administrations. And although these tests weren't fully digital, they were integrating technology into the assessment process for both the examiner and examinee. And so a preliminary comparability study that was conducted by Jordan Wright in 2016 looked at the WJ4 remote administration on the Presence platform, and it really found negligible effect sizes and no significant differences between in-person paper testing and remote on-screen administration of the WJ4 on the Presence platform. So it seemed like it really didn't matter to examinees if they were looking at test material on a physical test book or on a screen, seeing that same stimulus material. So just prior to the pandemic, the Association of Test Publishers and the International Testing Commission jointly released an early draft of a set of guidelines called the Guidelines for Technology-Based Assessment. And these guidelines address topics like technology-enhanced item development, universal design in digital testing, web connectivity, browser security, all sorts of issues that are related to administering tests in, especially high-stakes tests in digital environments. So really the attention to this topic by these two, really highly respected organizations underscored the idea that technology is not going away. It's going to be an integral component of assessment going forward and across all assessment, right? Not just licensure and certification or large-scale education, but clinical as well. Finally, the WJ4 or the WJ5 product team did some market research in the summer of 2020. And what that research revealed is that WJ4 users were really primed and ready to embrace a fully digital WJ5. So nearly 2/3 of the people who responded to that survey indicated that they would rather administer tests digitally than in paper. So that at that point, 2/3, right? So 66% of the WJ4 users said they would rather go digital than paper. And of the respondents, almost 80% of them agreed with the statement that digital tests would be the norm within 3 to 5 years. So I think, really customers were ready. Customers were getting used to the idea of administering tests like the WJ in digital formats. And so all of that was happening when these decisions were being made about, what was going to happen with the WJ5 during the summer of 2020. As you can imagine, once the decision was made that the WJ5 was going to be digital, this was in the summer of 2020, the entire project plan had to be scrapped and rebuilt, right? So we had this project plan that had us developing paper materials in 2020 and 2021, norming the test in 2021, and then doing all of the final product work and manual writing and publishing the product in 2023. So we knew with this new digital thing that this was not going to happen by 2023. So kind of went back to the drawing board, basically built up a whole new project plan. And this roadmap shows kind of at a high level the stages of that new project plan that we knew would be required to get this digital platform ready for norming. So during the planning phase, we knew that we were going to have to identify the goals and constraints for the platform and really make some big decisions about hardware, software, operating system, those kinds of decisions. And we knew that those decisions needed to be made before we could even start beginning to think about designing, right? So once those decisions had been made, we would go to the design and build phase. And there we would work with platform designers, software engineers, UI, UX designers, really to design the platform interface, write the logic for how all the tests would be administered on the platform, and then do all of the work to adapt the test content for delivery on that platform. During the pilot phase, we knew we were going to have to administer tests from the new platform and just see if they worked, right? To put them in front of real people, gather information about what works, what doesn't work. In some cases, we knew we were going to have to go back to the drawing board. And you'll learn, some more about this later when I show you some of the examples. But, thinking about how you take something from a paper administration to a digital administration, it's like very detail oriented. You have to think about every single detail and every single instruction and how do I say this and how is this going to be implemented or integrated into the platform. So there's just a lot of details, and we knew that we weren't going to do it right the first time, right? We knew that we might come up with an idea, we might think it works great, and then we build it and put it in front of people and they think, oh my gosh, this is so confusing, I have no idea how to do this. So we kind of planned and built into the schedule some time for that piloting and iteration where we knew that we were going to have to go back to the drawing board on some things and maybe start over if what we first thought was working wasn't working. Finally, at the last stage before norming, we were going to evaluate the data. And this is just taking some of the data that we gathered during that pilot research and, looking to see, is it comparable? Are we seeing the same kind of trends in the data that we see in the paper data? So that we just really ensure that we're not making such drastic changes to the test that we're measuring something different in digital. And so we knew that there was going to need to be some evaluation of, really the comparability between paper and digital, just to make sure that we weren't breaking anything. So in the planning phase, the first thing we did was just to outline some high-level goals and constraints for this new digital platform. So goals in the sense of what do we want to accomplish, and then constraints as in what do we want to make sure not to break in the process. So first, research that had been conducted on the various editions of the WJ over the prior 30 years supported the validity of the test and cluster scores as measures of CHC broad and narrow abilities. So it was really imperative that the test tasks in the digital platform not be so different from the paper versions that they fundamentally change what's being measured. And so for many tests, like those where the examinee sees something on the test book and then responds orally, we felt confident that the construct in digital wasn't going to change. But for other tests, we knew that we would be really changing the examinee's experience quite significantly in the digital platform, either by changing the item presentation or the mode of response, or maybe both. And so maintaining the psychometric characteristics of the items and the tests was really the primary and the most important goal. Second, we wanted to make sure that the digital delivery would truly make testing tasks easier for examiners by automating some of the routine tasks that, things like figuring out starting points, navigating forward and backward between items, computing raw test scores. At the same time, we also wanted to make sure that the examiners still had some transparency into the testing functions that the platform's going to be doing for them. So, as an example, you all know that in the past 30 years, tests like the WJ have gone from being completely hand-scored, right? So the the WJR was completely hand-scored using printed norm books. And then the WJ3, the test became computer-only scored. And now in the WJ4, it's web-based scoring. So each time that new technology has been introduced with each subsequent edition, there's always just a little bit of a painful transition and some growing pains, if you will, as the test users kind of lose a little bit of the transparency and control into what's happening like under the hood. So there's a certain amount of control that you have to give up, and as testing professionals, that's difficult to feel like you're, handing over the reins to a computer. So we really wanted to make sure that we provided enough transparency for users to trust that the platform is doing what it needs to do and be willing to give up some of that control over some of the testing functions that they're accustomed to doing themselves. Third, we also wanted to capitalize on the technology to make sure that the Examinee's interface was adding engagement and interest relative to the traditional paper materials, right? So we wanted it to be a better experience for the Examinee, not worse. And at the time, we needed to make sure that introducing technology for the Examinee didn't negatively impact their performance or their opportunity to succeed on the test. So it's important that we didn't make assumptions about the level of exposure that examinees might have to technology or the ease of use they might have with say, a tablet device. And that's, talking about young children, but all the way up through older adults, because of course, the WJ can be given through adulthood. So the Examinee interface really had to be foolproof. Next, and we talked about examiner errors earlier, so this is an important one. We wanted to reduce the rates of administration and clerical errors. So having the platform do a lot of that busy work, examiners really shouldn't need to worry about all the ins and outs of basal and ceiling requirements and knowing exactly how to compute raw scores. And so automating these tasks will essentially, take away a lot of the errors that I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not introducing new types of errors or a whole bunch of new ways that things could go wrong. So we didn't want to, in other words, trade off one error type for another. We knew we would need to be mindful to keep the examiner interface relatively easy and relatively easy to navigate and relatively intuitive, so that we're not introducing a whole new category of errors into test administration. And so then what follows from that is that by allowing the technology to do most of the heavy lifting, we really hoped to allow examiners to focus on their interactions with the examinee and focus on the examinee's behavior and some of those more qualitative things that you can get out of a testing session, and not have to be focusing so much on, what they're doing and interacting with the test materials. So before any work could be done on actually designing this new digital platform, there were some pretty big decisions that need to be made. So this point in the process, the decision had been made that WJ5 would be digital. And so now the team really had to figure out whether there should also be paper materials, right? So should there be corresponding test books and test records to go along with this digital version. And as I showed earlier, the majority of the WJ4 customers who'd been surveyed said that they did prefer to administer tests in digital format. But there were still about a third of the people who said that they'd rather stick with paper. So clearly it's nice for people to have the choice, but providing that choice comes along with several disadvantages. First, the publishing processes were going to have to change drastically for the digital version. We were stepping out of the typical production environment where test content's developed in word processing programs, and then it's fed through the traditional editorial and page composition and print production stages. For WJ5, all of the content was going to have to be digitized into some sort of a content management database for then publication on the platform. So developing paper materials at the same time as that digital effort was happening would essentially double the amount of production effort that was required. Next, and you'll see this in a little bit, a lot of the instructions to the examiner would have to necessarily be different in the digital platform from what they were in paper. So where the WJ4 instructions might tell you to point to something on the examinee's page, the WJ5 instructions might tell you to use your cursor to point to something on the examinee's screen. So these differences aren't huge, but they do have the potential to introduce some mode-related differences in examinee performance. Finally, and this is probably the biggest argument for not retaining paper, is that the amount of additional research that would be required to establish comparability between the paper and the digital formats was huge. So although Riverside didn't really anticipate that there would be a large change in the examinee experience for some tests, like tests where the examinee was just looking at something on the screen and responding to it, there were other tests like the fluency test, for example, where we expected the differences to be quite different in the examinee experience from paper to digital. So you think about the fluency tests and how they're administered in WJ4, where you're having the student use paper and pencil and go through and either cross out or circle things as quickly as they can, whereas on a tablet device they're going to be tapping things as quickly as they can. And so that really had the potential to to introduce some significant differences in examinee performance. And if that was the case, a lot of comparability research would have to be done, and potentially even separate norms for the paper and the digital versions. So given the time frame that we had and really the lower demand for paper already at that point, and this was 2020 when these things were happening, the final decision was made to publish the WJ5 in digital only. The next big design decision that really had to be made was, how was the WJ5 going to accommodate examinee responding on tests that required response booklets, right? So I'm talking about the tests that the examinee is writing numbers or letters or words. If the battery was going to be 100% digital, in other words, if we wanted to completely omit paper materials from the process altogether, there clearly had to be a plan for how the examinees would respond to tests that require written responses. And if it was clear that there would be even more of these in the WJ5, because by the time that we're making these decisions, we had already developed some early versions of some new tests like sentence writing accuracy and letter writing fluency, where examinee writing was an important part of the test. So the first question was, how do we administer these tests? Do we allow the examinee to type on a keyboard, for example? And keyboard typing might work for some of the tests, like spelling of sounds. It wasn't going to work for tests where the examinee was working out math problems like calculation, or this new letter writing fluency test where the examinee is asked to write letters as fast as they can. Since the assessment of an examinee's handwriting can be an important part of a diagnostic evaluation, the team felt that it was still pretty important for examinees to be able to handwrite responses for some of these tests. So the next consideration was stylus writing, right? So maybe we can allow the examinees to use a stylus to write on the iPad, and we can capture their responses that way. The nice thing about that is that these responses could then be stored as part of the digital record, and it seemed like a really nice to have feature. But a quick dive into the literature on this topic revealed that stylus writing is actually a very complex issue. So first of all, stylus devices vary drastically between brands and models, and I'm sure this is still the case. It was definitely the case in 2020. There are some models like the Apple Pencil, for example, that's sensitive to changes in pressure. So, depending on how hard you push on the screen, you're going to get different heaviness of the line. And then other styluses don't have that capability. Importantly, some of the models of stylus require you not to rest your hand on the screen. And others, like the Apple Pencil, have this thing called palm rejection that allows you to actually rest your hand on the screen, and it doesn't impact what you're writing. So we knew right off the bat that the stylus question had the potential to introduce, some unwanted sources of variance into the scores for these tests, unless, of course, Riverside was going to require users to purchase a specific stylus brand and model, which was not a desirable option at that point. There were also some serious, pretty serious construct-related reservations about having examinees write with a stylus instead of a pencil. So we reviewed a lot of research on this, and what we found is that the act of writing on a smooth surface, like a digital device screen with a stylus, it introduces a difference in the proprioceptive feedback that's needed to control your movement, because it reduces the friction on the writing surface. So one study that we looked at reviewed age-related differences in how kids write with styluses. And younger kids tended to write slower with the stylus, and they made fewer connections between their line segments, so their letters were not as well formed. While older kids tended to press down harder, and they'd write bigger letters, and they'd write actually more quickly. So evidence showed that there were some age-related differences in stylus writing, which again was kind of a disadvantage for the kinds of things we were going to be trying to measure with these tests. Finally, stylus devices are also very expensive. So, relative to the district budgets for most of the customers, requiring an expensive stylus like an Apple Pencil would really significantly increase the cost of using the battery without a whole lot of return on that extra investment, that extra cost for the user. So after a lot of consideration, a lot of thought, the team at Riverside decided to retain the paper response booklets, for tests that require the examinee to write letters, words, sentences, and numbers. And we'll talk a little more about that later. But generally speaking, the decision was made that retaining the paper response booklets was really the best approach to maintaining the construct of those tests in the tests that required writing. So next, the Riverside team really had some big decisions to make about software and hardware. So as you know, they had conducted some extensive market research with some of the WJ4 and other clinical customers, and they gleaned some takeaways from that helped to inform some of these software and hardware decisions. So as for the platform, most people said that they would prefer a browser-based platform over an app, and there were two reasons for that. So, the first reason is that apps, as we all know, require users to download updates regularly. We've all had the experience of going to use one of our apps, and then we find out that it needs an update, and we have to, do the update and wait for it to load before we can use the app. So the school customers told us that in their districts, that often those app updates have to be made with somebody who has credentials or somebody who's the specific district IT person, and oftentimes that person's not even in the same building. And so sometimes they'll sit down to do a test with a kid and then they find out that their app isn't updated and they can't even launch their test. So as you can imagine, that can leave people in a pinch, and they're basically wasting their time there. So browser-based was definitely a preference that we heard. The other nice thing about browser-based systems is that all of the data goes immediately to the cloud backup. And so if you lose your iPad, if you lose your laptop, if something gets damaged, there's no loss in your testing data. Things are being captured and updated in real time. Any updates to the software itself happen under the hood, and when you log in, those updates are automatically in place. So for the examiner device, most of the people in the survey said that they would do their own work on a laptop or Chromebook. So they were, while the tablets were available in their district and kids were working on tablets, most of the examiners said that they themselves were still using laptops or Chromebooks. And most of them said that the reason for this is that they preferred having a physical keyboard. So the decision was made to have the examiner device be a laptop or a computer. Now for the examinee device, most of the respondents said that they would like to have the kid or the student working on a tablet rather than on a computer. So most of them said that their schools are using tablets anyway in the classroom for regular instruction and assessment, and that most of the students are comfortable working on tablets. We also heard, through the pandemic that more and more schools were purchasing tablets, and so it wasn't unusual for most kids to have their own tablets by this point. Finally, people who were already using digital tests on other platforms said that Bluetooth communication between the two tablet devices can often be unstable, and so it's not unusual for their tablets to disconnect mid-test. So the decision for the WJ5 was to have the examiner and examinee devices both connecting to each other, but through a shared browser session rather than through Bluetooth. So how does using this new platform look for you as an examiner from a logistic perspective, right? So the first thing you're going to do when you're going to administer the WJ5 is you're going to make sure you have a stable internet connection, and you're going to go ahead and log into Riverside Score on your browser. And this is on your laptop. So there you're going to add the examinee's information. You're going to decide what tests you want to administer, and then you're going to assign those to the examinee. And this all happens at your Riverside Score dashboard. And you can do this ahead of time, or you can do it right before you test. It only takes a minute or so to get your test session set up. So again, you can do it ahead of time, you can do it the day before, or if you just want to wait until you have your student right there, you can do it while they're getting comfortable. Then when you launch the testing session, you're going to see a QR code on your laptop screen. And so just like, right now we're used to going to restaurants and having to scan the menu, this is a very similar thing. You're going to hold your iPad up to the computer screen. You're going to scan that code. And when the code is recognized by the iPad, it's going to then enter the browser session that your laptop is on. So now these two devices are interacting with each other through that browser connection. Then you can hand the iPad to the examinee and you're ready to start testing. Now, when you're done testing, you can run your score reports from the Riverside Score platform, and then you can print or save them. And again, you can do that immediately, or you can do it the next day or a week later. It doesn't matter. You'll also see in this diagram here that I'm showing a mouse. And so I really strongly recommend that you use a mouse for administration. During the norming study, we actually required people to use a mouse. And as you'll see later, the reason why is that there are some tests that require you to navigate the user interface pretty quickly, where you're going to have to be clicking on things very quickly as the examinee is talking. And so our observation during the piloting stages was that people who were using a mouse could just navigate the interface a lot better than people who were using their laptop's touchpad. The other thing I want to mention about the mouse is that you should look for one that's silent. We found during the norming study that a lot of the examinees were distracted by the clicking sound from the mouse, and they were just much less, I guess, distracted and much more focused when the examiners used a silent mouse. So one of the biggest questions that people have been asking since the WJ5 was announced is, do I have to use an iPad or can I use any kind of tablet? And I'm going to tell you my personal answer to that question, and that is that I would strongly recommend that you use an iPad. And I want to spend some time talking about why. So, the test content, it's the case that it will show up on a different kind of tablet. So if you had a Samsung and you have a browser, yes, you can administer the tests on another tablet. And it's probably generally going to look the same. But I really do think that your examinee scores have the potential to be impacted if you use a different kind of tablet. And I just want to explain a little bit about why that is. So all smart devices have a specification that's called touch latency. And touch latency is the amount of time that it takes your device to recognize that you've made a tap on the screen. So when you tap on your phone, for example, and sometimes it'll make a little flash or a clicking noise, or sometimes a button will turn color once you've tapped on it. The amount of time that it takes for that to happen is measured in milliseconds, and that's defined as touch latency. So human brains also have kind of a specification, a similar specification, if you will, that's called just noticeable difference, or JND is how it's abbreviated. And JND is the time that it takes our brains to register a difference in time between a pair of stimuli. So, how long does it take between when something happens and when your brain actually recognizes that it happens? And researchers have done a lot of work in this, and they've sort of settled on about 70 milliseconds of just noticeable difference for a tapping response. So as humans, it takes us, if something happens in faster than 70 milliseconds, it feels instantaneous. If it happens in longer than 70 milliseconds delay, it's going to feel like we can notice a difference. We can notice that there's a lag, right? So in other words, when the lag between tapping on your screen and the screen recognition of that tap is greater than 70 milliseconds, you're going to be able to tell. We've all had the experiences where our phone or tablets are acting laggy, and that's actually the word we use to describe it. We say my phone's really, really laggy. So just noticeable difference is basically when things start feeling laggy to us. So there's a lot of tablets on the market, and their touch latency specifications vary widely. Apple devices in particular have a very high control over touch latency, whereas other types of other models of devices have touch latencies that can range up to 300 milliseconds and some even higher, which, 300 milliseconds is over 4 times the lag that a human's brain can perceive. So those devices are going to just feel slow and laggy to you, right? So I have a video here, and this shows you the difference between an Apple device and a Samsung on the right. And so this video is a few years old. So this particular iPad had a touch latency of 90 milliseconds, which is higher than the commercially available iPads today, but it's still relatively fast and very close to our just noticeable difference of 70. Whereas the Samsung device on the right has a latency of 330 milliseconds, which is actually on the high end of the commercial specifications. And so this video has been slowed way down so that you can see the difference between these two devices. So watch what happens when the stylus device taps the screen. The Apple device, as you can see, responds almost immediately because the button turns blue. But the Samsung device, you can see it's just now turning the button gray. So even when these two taps are made at the same time, you can see the difference in how long it takes for that Samsung device with the tap latency of 330 milliseconds to actually register that tap has been made. So you might be asking, what does this all have to do with WJ5? Well, we envisioned that a lot of our processing speed tests were going to be moving from the response booklet to the iPad screen. And so these are the tests where the examinee is responding to as many items as possible in 2 minutes or in 3 minutes. And when we're administering those kinds of tests, a laggy device is going to be really bad, right? So if the examinee has to wait for their tap to register on the screen, and if that tap takes more than 70 milliseconds to register, which is the human average JND, they're likely going to slow down and they're going to tap more deliberately and more slowly. So we really wanted to ensure that examinees would not perceive any lag in their tapping responses when they're taking these fluency tests. And we know that because Apple has relatively tight controls on its touch latency specifications, we really decided that we had to go iPad for norming. We really needed to have more control than we would have if we had allowed a lot of different devices. So we know that there are less expensive options out there, but unfortunately, introducing touch latency into your scores really has the potential to invalidate the interpretations you're going to be making from the tests. So once the big decisions had been made about hardware and software, the team was ready to start thinking about some of the fun stuff like the actual platform design. And so the first thing that happened was the administration interface itself needed to be administered. And this needed to be an interface that would be agnostic to whatever test was being administered. So it really needed to be kind of a one size fits all, and each test would then be integrated into this platform. And so the way that we did that is we actually thought about the way that people give tests in paper. And so we took that whole process of all of the interactions that happen between an examiner and examinee, and the examiner and the paper materials, and the examinee and the paper materials. And we just really broke that down and kind of dissected it into very minute steps. And then that whole process was kind of rethought through and thinking about how could we do that in the digital interface? What kind of tools would be needed to do this task or that task? And so that was a really interesting process that we went through. And what resulted then is this interface that you're looking at here. And this is what we call the examiner's interface. This is what you're going to see on your laptop when you're in the middle of administering a test. So I'm just going to walk you through this interface because I think it will provide some nice context for some of the things I'll be showing you later, just to give you a little bit of orientation to what the features are and where things are on the screen. So in the middle here, we have what we call the examiner's view. And this examiner's view has basically all of the things that you would have in your test book on your examiner's page. And it also incorporates a lot of what was in the test record. So up here, you've got your item number. That's always going to be black. If there are any instructions that you need to read silently, they'll also be in black, just like in the test book. Anything that you read out loud to the examinee is still going to be blue, just like it was in paper. Down here, you've got your scoring interface. And this particular test has items that are scored, the examinee responds orally, and then the examiner has to score the item by selecting the examinee's response from this scoring key. And if the examinee says, I don't know, or they don't respond at all, then the examiner can use these keys. And then the platform will automatically assign a score of 1 or 0 to that response. If there was audio recording on this item, there would also be a little play button right here, right next to the item. And that is so that you can go ahead and just hit play on that button. You don't have to be dealing with external audio equipment. So every item has the play button for that item's audio recording integrated right into the interface here. All right, the next thing I want to show you is the examinee's view. And this examinee's view is essentially exactly what the examinee is seeing on their iPad at any given time. This is just a mirror image. And so in this particular item, the examinee is seeing this word on their iPad. There will be some things where the examinee is going to be tapping on this iPad, and when that happens, you'll be able to see their taps showing up. There's some other things here on this. Something that's really interesting is if you were to take your cursor, so if I was to be, using my cursor on my examiner's view, and if I were to roll over onto the examinee's view, my cursor would turn into a pointer. So there's going to be a little pointer tool. So if I'm instructed that I need to point to something on the examinee's view, I can just use my cursor to do that. I don't need to reach across the table and look at the examinee's iPad and tap there or point there. If you want to manually change that pointer from a finger pointer to an arrow pointer, you can use this button here to do that. This little I button here, this one, is for the purpose of turning off the examinee's view of the iPad. So if the examinee is looking at something on their iPad and they're maybe having trouble focusing on what you're saying, or they're just distracted by what's on the iPad, you can always click this button right here and their iPad will just turn white. And then if you click it again, the material will pop back up. This button here just allows you to collapse and expand this examinee's view if you need more space on your screen. This little green button is a way you can check your internet connection. So if you roll over that, it's going to tell you about your internet speed and make sure that you have a strong enough connection to be testing. And then this button here just allows you to replay. If you have a video or an instructional animated video that you want to play on the examinee's iPad, you can replay that using this button here. This panel over here we call the side navigation, and the side navigation is essentially the way that you can kind of tell where you are in the test. So every item or every item set in the test actually has a little card here with an item number and item set number. And you'll see this test is actually administered by blocks. So you have block A, which contains item 1 to 3, block B, which it contains items 4 to 10, and so on. So when you're testing and you actually reach one of these blocks, this card here that says A is going to expand, and you'll see all the individual items inside of it. And that way you can just kind of keep track of where you are in the test without too much scrolling up and down. And the idea of the design of this side navigation was really trying to mirror what you see on the test record form as you're giving the test in paper. So when you're administering a test in paper, you're going to be marking, in most cases, 1s and 0s in a column. And so at any given time, you can look up and you can tell where you started, and you can tell if the examinee's gotten a basal. You can tell how many items you need to keep administering until you reach a ceiling. And so it's just kind of a nice way to visually scan and see how the examinee is doing in the test and where you are in the test. And so the idea here was to kind of create that same visual. When you're administering an item, you're going to see a little kind of half completed check mark here, and that just means this is the item that you're on. Any items that you've already given are going to have a check mark icon next to them, and that check mark is going to be green if it was a scored item that the examinee answered correctly, and it's going to be red if it's an item that the examinee answered incorrectly. And so that's kind of analogous to the 1s and 0s on your test record form. Okay, down here we have what we call the bottom ribbon. And in the bottom ribbon, you just have, again, some navigation things that are useful during the test. Here we have what we call the basal and ceiling counter. And this particular test has blocks, but this last block is actually administered with basal and ceiling rules. So that's why these counters are down here. And what will happen is, as you're administering a test, when the examinee is working on a basal string, right, these little dots are going to turn green for each item that they answer correctly in a row. And if they suddenly get one wrong before they've reached the end of this basal string, then the basal string is going to all go blank again, and it will start back over when the examinee starts getting items correct again. So this is basically just a way, even though you're not the one that has to manage the basal and ceiling rules, the platform's going to do that for you, but it's still giving you the information, so at any given time you know whether a basal has been obtained. And the same thing here with the ceiling. As you're working on the ceiling, as the examinee is getting items incorrect, these little dots are going to start turning red. And if you get to the end of this line of dots, then the test will end. So that's just a nice little useful tool to kind of help you keep track of where you are while you're testing. This field here will just tell you what the score was of this item. If it's a test that's administered in item sets, like where there's 10 items on a screen, this is just going to keep track of how many items were answered correctly on that screen. This little button here that looks like an eye with a circle around it, this is where you're going to click to get information about scoring and administering the test. So it's going to be the information that used to appear on the first page of the test book. You're going to see that information when you launch the test, but you can also return to that information at any time during the test by clicking this little icon. And if you click that icon and that information pops up on your screen, it's not going to be visible to the examinee. So if you just need to make a quick reminder to yourself about how you score a test or how you administer it, you can use that button. This little flag icon is how you mark an item to come back to later for review. And when you click that button, you're going to get a little box that pops up, and you can select to flag that item for further review, and you can also type notes about it if you'd like. Up here we have what's called the top ribbon, and the information here is the test name, of course. Here you have this little person icon. This is where you can hover over and see the examinee's name and their grade and their birth date and age. This little piece of paper here is another way that you can write notes. So at any time during the test, if you click on that, you're just going to get a little text box that will pop up, and those notes will all be saved, and you'll have the option of printing them out with your score report. This little navigation menu over here, we call this the main navigation. If you were to click on this, that would take you back to your dashboard. It would also allow you to navigate between tests in your session. So if you have tests designated to be administered in a certain order and you decide that you'd rather skip around a little bit, you can always go over here and decide which test you want to administer next. This little button here, this little green icon, just tells me, because it's glowing red, it tells me that the session is being recorded. So you again have the option to not record the session, but if it is being recorded, you will know it because this button is red. If this test was a timed test, there would also be a button here right next to the microphone that would be a stopwatch, and that stopwatch would have the running time as the timer is working through the test. So hopefully you can see that everything here has been designed with, efficient and easy administration in mind. So hopefully that will just help you to give you a little bit of orientation to what you'll be seeing on some of the remaining slides. So hopefully that little mini tour of the examiner's platform will just give you a little bit of orientation and context. Now I want to talk a little bit about the examinee's interface, the iPad screen. And so there were several design considerations that we had to think about in terms of the iPad. The first being, what size, right? How big of an iPad screen do we want to design for? So the decision was made to go with an iPad screen with a minimum of 10.2-inch screen resolution. And the reason that we set that restriction is because looking at some of the test interfaces that we were thinking about, especially the fluency tests where we have examinees tapping their responses on little buttons on the screen, it just became clear pretty quickly that the iPad mini was going to be too small. The buttons would have needed to be so close together and so small that we would have run into problems with tapping accuracy, and we really didn't want to deal with that. So 10.2-inch was the minimum size. The next thing we had to think about was font. And again, these are just things that people may not realize a lot of thought actually went into picking out this font. So in thinking about a font, when we looked back at the WJ4 materials, there were actually several different fonts that had been used on the examinee facing pages, and a lot of times it depended on the size of the stimulus and also the age, the expected age of the examinee that would be encountering that. And so we decided for this digital platform that we wanted to go with a more streamlined approach and to use the same font for all of the stimulus material. And the font that we chose was Andica. And you can see some examples here of Andica, both lowercase and uppercase letters. And the reason that we chose this font is because it does what it needs to do for young readers. In other words, it's got what we call the one-story A's and G's, and sometimes fonts will have, and in fact a lot of times fonts will have some A's and G's that look very different in lowercase. And so we wanted to make sure that was, those letters were recognizable to young readers, but we also wanted to make sure that the font wasn't so childlike that it was inappropriate for adults as well. And so this was the font that we settled on. One of the interesting things about designing test materials, specifically test materials on an iPad, is that sometimes you have to actually break protocol for what's considered best practice in design to maintain your standardization across devices for the actual test content. And so that's something that I hadn't really thought about before I worked on this project, but it became really evident as we were working on these designs and thinking about how to display visual stimulus to examinees. So for example, typically when you see something displayed on an iPad, like a picture, right? Let's pretend this is a 10.5-inch iPad. If you were to then look at that same picture on a bigger iPad, the picture is going to be bigger. And if you were to look at it on a smaller iPad, the picture is going to be smaller. And in most worlds, the fact that the pictures will automatically resize to fit the size of the screen or the resolution of the screen is actually a really good thing. But when you're designing for a standardized test, you want everyone to see the images in the exact same size. So this item is a really good example of why that's important. Imagine this is a test item and that line is exactly 2 inches long on a 10.5-inch iPad screen, right? So about how many inches is this line? And the correct response is something approximating 2 inches. Now, that same image is going to be bigger on a 13-inch iPad. So suddenly that line is no longer 2 inches, maybe it's 3 inches, right? So now the answer to the question is actually different. So this is a really extreme example just to prove this point, although we do actually have an item like this in the WJ, so it's not an unrealistic example. But when you're presenting test stimulus material to examinees, obviously it's really important that everyone has the same experience. So standardizing the presentation of the visual stimulus is really an important part of keeping the experience identical across examinees, and of course contributes to the validity of the scores. So I mentioned earlier that the WJ5 digital had to break from best practice in some cases, best practice and design protocol. And this is one of those cases where we really needed images to not resize based on the screen resolution. And so instead, we wanted them to stay the same size for all the examinees, regardless of what size screen they were working on. So the way that we handled this was to design for a 10.5-inch screen, and then introduce this margin of white space around the outside of the image if it happened to be displayed on a larger screen. So in this particular test item, no matter what size screen the examinee is using, that line is always going to be about 2 inches long, right? Exactly 2 inches long. And the area outside of that margin is just going to be white space, just dead space. And of course, that dashed line doesn't show up on the iPad. I'm just putting that here so you can see kind of how we handled that. Now that the high-level platform design existed, it was time for the team to begin adapting the 60 tests onto the platform. So the first step was for the Riverside product owner and the UI UX design team and the content development team at Riverside to work together to design the interface for each test. And I keep using that term UI UX. I'm sorry for anybody who isn't familiar with that term, as I wasn't. That stands for user interface and user experience. In other words, these are the people who are the experts in how people interact with technology and how to implement like best design practices to ensure that the interface is intuitive and that it's user friendly and that people can figure out what to do. Next, the Riverside content development team worked with the editors and they revised all the test instructions item by item and made sure that they were appropriate for presentation on the digital platform. So again, where the instructions might have said point to something on the examinee's page, now you had to say point to something in the examinee's view, on the examinee's screen. So there were just a lot of wording changes that needed to be made, and as well as actual like workflow instructions, just a lot of editing that needed to be done to the test instructions in general. And finally, the development team worked with the software engineers to design the logic or the workflow for each test. And by logic, I'm referring to things like how does the test start and end? How do users get routed from item to item or from item set to item set? How does the platform compute the test score at the end of the test? So all of that had to be written into the form of user requirements or software requirements. And then the software developers had to actually implement that logic into the code underlying the platform. So the first thing I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the design of the user interface for each of the individual tests. Out of trying to squeeze 60 different tests into this high-level interface that we had designed was pretty overwhelming. There are just so many nuanced differences among the tests in the battery, and trying to capture all that felt really difficult. So similar to what we did when we designed the overall platform, the way we approached the individual test-by-test design was just to break each test into individual tasks, sort of like a dissection, right? So we thought about the various actions that you take when you administer each test and things like, how do you know where to start? What kind of a starting point rule does it use? How do you navigate to the right item? How do you navigate to the right audio? How are the instructions presented to the examinee, and do you point to things or not? How do you evaluate the accuracy of a response, and how do you assign a score? How do you determine which item to give next and when to end the test? And things like, how is the raw score computed? So all of these things, we just kind of went through and assigned various characteristics to each test. And then we took the 60 tests and we actually organized them into groups of shared characteristics for both administration and scoring. So, for example, one way to classify the tests or to group the tests was how are the items within each test grouped for administration. So for most tests, examinees see or hear one item at a time. For some of the tests, examinees are going to see a whole set of items, like 10 items at a time on the iPad, or they'll see a whole page of items in the response booklet, or they hear an entire story from the audio recording. So again, we're able to group them based on how they are appearing in the test itself. Another way to group tests is how are they presented? Are they oral? Are they audio? Do they have visual stimulus? Are they presented on the iPad, or are they presented in the response booklet? We can also think about how does the examinee respond to the items? Is the examinee's response oral or written, or does the examinee tap on the iPad? We can group them by scoring mechanism. So for example, does the examiner score the item, or does the examinee select a response and then the platform automatically scores the item? Or does the examiner select a response and the platform automatically scores it? So there's lots of different ways among the tests that the items can be scored or that scores can be assigned to items. Finally, we looked at the different ways that tests can terminate, right? Some tests end when you reach a ceiling. Some tests end when the timer runs out. Some tests end when you've given all of the items on the test. Some tests end when the examinee has reached a continuation threshold or some sort of cutoff. So there's just lots of different ways that the test can end. And as you can see here, this matrix kind of came together where by grouping tests with shared characteristics, we were really able to come up with about 6 categories of test types. And those categories you can see over here. And we assign these names to the test categories. So the basic category covers more than half of the tests in the battery, and these are tests that have relatively straightforward item presentation. They're usually presented one item at a time. They have relatively straightforward scoring rules, termination rules. Think of tests like oral vocabulary, letter word identification, numbers reversed. These are just sort of your standard tests. The fluency category applied to 8 tests. And fluency are tests where the examinee works against a timer and completes as many items as they can within the allotted time. So within the fluency category are tests like number pattern matching, sentence reading fluency, where the examinee would be working on an iPad and tapping their responses to each item. But it also included tests like math facts fluency, where examinees would work in a response booklet. So you can see that even within some of these categories of tests, there would be like subcategories, but I'm just kind of showing you kind of the main high-level categories here. We had a multiple choice category, and this really only applies to 3 tests, and that's block rotation, spatial relations, and then the new matrices tests. And the defining characteristic of the multiple choice item type is just that the examinee is tapping their response on the iPad one item at a time, and then the platform is assigning a score to that item. So these are items that are automatically scored by the platform, but based on the examinee's tapping response. But unlike the fluency test, they're not done against a timer, so they're slightly different from the fluency tests. In the retrieval category, we only had 2 tests, and they were semantic word retrieval and phonemic word retrieval. And these are just a little bit of oddball tests in terms of the way that they're scored. So on these tests, the examinee says as many words as they can think of within 1 minute, and the examiner is listening to their response, and they're counting all of the unique correct words. So these tests would not only need a timing element, but they'd also need a unique scoring interface because the examiner has to keep track of the correct words that the examinee says in real time. The next category we called scored elements, and there was only 3 tests in this category. This included story recall, reading recall, and oral reading. And the scored elements characteristics or defining features are that these tests are all tests where the examinee listens to a story or reads a story, and then the examiner has to score test or the item element by element. So either the examiner is keeping track of all of the words that the examinee says correctly, or they're keeping track of all of the words that the examinee says incorrectly in the case of oral reading. So again, this set of tests just had some defining features, and we put that together in a group. Finally, the last category were the RAN tests. These were the rapid automatic naming tests, and these included the 4 new tests as well as the old picture vocabulary tests. I'm sorry, not picture vocabulary, rapid picture naming. And these tests were quite different from the others in the sense that on these, the examiner actually has to be working very quickly to make scoring decisions as the test is happening. So in a way, these tests are the examinee's timed, but kind of the examiner is also timed. And so we had to really make sure that the scoring interface for these RAN tests was so foolproof as to not introduce, construct irrelevant variance of how long does it take the examiner to make a judgment and score the item. So again, we had 6 general categories. There are a few one-off tests that didn't fit into any of these 6 categories. Tests like understanding directions was one of those. A couple of the new executive function measures. Those tests were just so different that they really have their own designs, and I'm not going to really cover them here today. They're also tests that are not part of the initial Riverside first launch, so I didn't think we needed to talk about them today, but just generally speaking, these were the sort of the categories of tests that we came up with. Finally reached the fun part where I'm going to start showing you some videos and some stuff on the platform. But before I do that, I just want to orient you to some of the features that you're going to see on these video clips. And again, you saw all this when I did the little mini tour, but I want to just show you some of these things in real time and just walk you through how these features actually look as they're being used. So I'm using for this example the oral vocabulary synonyms test, and this is just a short introduction to some of the platform features. Each time you launch a test, the first thing you're going to see is this administration overview page. And this is the information that used to be on the first page of the test book. It's got information about how to administer the items and then how to score. Over here on the right, you can see your things to know panel, and this just tells you that for this test, you're going to have items that are going to be presented by audio recording, and that this test uses voice capture. If you need to check your audio settings, you can click this link, and you can check both your speaker and your microphone volume. Once you're ready to begin, you can click Let's Begin, and you'll see this box pop up. This box is going to give you the opportunity to override your starting point. So my examinee is in grade 5, but if I wanted to start this person a little higher, I could always do that using this drop down. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this starting point at its default. And if I want to turn the voice capture off, I would do that here with this toggle. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it on, and I'm going to click Start Test. Now, as soon as I start the test, the examinee's iPad is going to launch, and it's going to have the item stimulus appear. So you'll see that here when I click Start Test. And now I can see over here what the examinee is seeing on their iPad screen. Just like in the paper WJ4, you're going to have the words that you need to say out loud are going to be in blue, and all the instructions that you don't read out loud or the item numbers are going to be in black. So I'm just going to read this introduction. Another word that means house is home. And then I can go ahead and advance to the next screen. This button down here allows you to advance to the next screen after you're done giving each item. The text next to this button is always going to tell you where the platform is going to take you next. So in this case, the first item I'm going to hit is sample item A, trial 1. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And you can see that the examinee's word changed. So now they're seeing the word big on their screen. And I have my instructions up here. Tell me another word for big. So depending on what the examinee says, this is my scoring interface here. So if the examinee says large, I would click here. If the examinee says gigantic, I would click here. If they say small, I would click here. Now, if the examinee says something that's not in this scoring key, you can always use these other buttons, 0 and 1. So if I wanted to say, for example, the examinee said a word that wasn't in the scoring key, but I know it's not a correct response, I would click this 0, and I can go ahead and read the feedback. And then if I want to, I can type the word that the examinee said. I don't have to do that, but it's certainly an option. If I want to deselect a score, for example, if the examinee says a word and then they decide to correct themselves and say a different word, I can just click again to deselect it. So let's just say that the examinee said small. So I'm going to go ahead and click small, and I'm going to read these words here. Another word for big is large. Let's try that again. And then I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next item. And you can see that because the examinee got this item wrong, it's going to take me to trial 2 of the same item. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. The examinee is still seeing the same word on their screen, but now I'm going to read the question again. Tell me another word for big. And let's say that this time the examinee says large. So I'm going to go ahead and click large. Now you can see over here that this is keeping track of the items that you've given. We started with sample item A, trial 1. The examinee answered it incorrectly, and now we're on sample item A, trial 2, and I've gone ahead and given that a correct response. So I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next screen, which is going to be Introduction 2. And now I'm going to read this. Now you will hear words from your speaker. After you hear 2 beeps, tell me the answer. And I'm going to go ahead and advance to sample item B. Now you can see here, this is the first item that I have an audio recording. So this little blue button is going to allow you to play the audio recording, but if you'd prefer to just read the item out loud, you can do that as well because we're providing you with the script here. I'm going to go ahead and hit play.
Tell me another word for nap.
And when the audio is done playing, the examinee will give you their response. And let's say that this examinee said sleep. So I'm going to go ahead and click sleep. And then I'm going to advance to the next item. And you can see here that the next item is going to be item 1, the first item on the test. I want to show you the administration of several tests, one test of each type from that matrix. So the first one I'm going to show you is a basic test. And so remember, the basic tests are about half of the tests in the battery. And on these tests, the items are always presented one at a time. And they're either presented orally by the examiner, or they're presented from an audio recording, or they are appearing in the response booklet, like in the case of spelling or writing samples. And the examinee responses on basic tests are either oral or writing. The examiner scores the items by selecting the response or the item score in the platform interface, and then the test ends when you either reach a ceiling or a cutoff point. So all of the basic tests fall into those general characteristics. And so the one that I'm going to demonstrate here for you today is verbal analogies. And on this test, the examinee is going to see an incomplete analogy on their iPad screen, and they're going to hear me read the analogy orally, and then the examinee will provide a word that finishes the analogy. So I want you to just kind of notice how the platform integrates all the different parts of the administration into this one interface, and then just sort of guides me through the test. I also want you to notice on this one how loud the mouse sounds, because when I first started this, I didn't have my silent mouse, and it's really loud, and I think it's going to demonstrate for you why we recommend that you use a quiet mouse when you're giving these tests. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you.
Finish what I say. A bird flies, a fish
swims.
Horse is too big as mouse is too
Small.
Banana is to milk as eat is to
I don't know.
Banana is to milk as eat is to drink. Let's do that again. Banana is to milk as eat is to
Drink.
The next category of tests that I want to show is one of the fluency tests. And so the fluency tests, remember, there were 8 of these, and they're all administered with item sets, so 10 items at a time typically. And they all have visual material either on the iPad or in the response booklet that an examinee needs to interact with. All of these tests are timed, and the test automatically ends when the timer runs out. So the one I'm going to show you here is word reading fluency. And so on this test, the examinee is going to see rows of words on their iPad screen, and then they're going to have to tap the 2 words in each row that go together. I'm going to show you the administration of the sample items and the practice exercise, just so you can get a sense of the interface elements. you're going to see my screen, and then again in the lower right-hand corner, you're going to be able to see just a view of the examinee's iPad that they're working on. And I apologize, the video quality is not great here. I did the best I could, but I think you're going to be able to see it well enough to see what's happening on the iPad. So while you're watching this, there's just a couple things I want you to try to watch out for. So notice when I roll my cursor over to the examinee's view on my own screen that you'll see my little pointer tool show up, and then you'll be able to see on the examinee's iPad that he's seeing the same little pointer. And again, this is the mechanism that allows me to point to things without having to lean across the table and point to things on his iPad. It's pretty small in the video, but I think you should be able to see it if you look closely. I also want you to notice how when the examinee taps on his iPad, that I immediately see those responses showing up in real time on my screen, on my examinee's view panel. The other thing I want you to look at is how the timers for the practice exercise and the test items are integrated right into my test script. So as I'm reading the instructions, you'll see that the button for starting the timer is actually right there as part of the item instructions. So I don't have to, I don't have to look to a different part of my screen to start the timer. It's just I'm reading the script and then my timer button is right there. So those are the things I want you to look for. Here we go.
I want you to read some words and then decide which two words go together. If the words were apple, tree, moon, and banana, you would choose apple and banana because they are both fruit. If the words were pear, drum, couch, and chair, you would choose couch and chair because they are both furniture. Look at these words. Two of them go together. Tap the two words that go together. That's right. Now look at these words. Tap the words that go together. That's right. Now you will see 4 more rows of words on your screen. Tap the two words that go together in each row. Work as quickly as you can without making mistakes. If you do make a mistake, just tap the one you want to change and then tap your new answer. When you are done, tap the Done button at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead. Now you will see 2 more rows of words like these. Tap the 2 words in each row that go together. Start at the top of your screen and do each row. When you get to the bottom of your screen, tap Next. Keep working until I tell you to stop. Work as quickly as you can without making mistakes. If you do make a mistake, just tap the one you want to change and then tap your new answer. If you have trouble reading the words or finding the 2 words that go together, skip that one and go on to the next one. You will have 3 minutes. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
To show you an example of a multiple choice test. On these tests, the examinee sees the item stimulus on the iPad and just taps their responses. These items are presented one at a time on the iPad, and when the examinee taps an answer choice, the platform will automatically score the item as correct or incorrect. So as an examiner, you really just need to read the instructions and navigate screen to screen. You don't need to be doing any scoring on these. The platform's automatically going to end the test once the examinee has reached a ceiling or a cutoff. So I'm going to use block rotation here for this example. Just like the last video, you're going to see the examinee working on their iPad. At the same time, you'll see my screen. And there are a few things I want you to notice as you're watching. So first, you'll see that the instructional text for this test has actually been made into an animated video. So when you gave this test from the paper test book, there were instructions telling you to point to things on the examinee's page as you were talking, and it was actually really hard to do because you needed to be reading text on your page and then also looking around to the other side of the book to make sure that you're pointing to the right place on the examinee's page. And so by turning all of those instructions into a video, we can make sure that every examinee sees and hears the instructions the same way, which of course just makes the administration more standardized. These kinds of videos have been added to several of the WJ tests. So the controlled learning tests like concept formation and analysis synthesis, for those tests, removing all the pointing instructions just ensures that everybody's hearing the same instructions and everybody has the same opportunity to learn the rules for the test. Also on this video, notice that when the examinee taps his answers, my screen shows the responses either being correct or incorrect. So on this test, the examinee actually has to tap 2 of the drawings for each item. So when he's tapped only 1, you'll see that the response shows up as incorrect. But then once he taps his second correct response, the platform then automatically changes to correct. So you can kind of watch that in the scoring interface. Let's see here. Finally, you'll see that on my screen, there are like little green arrows that are pointing to the correct responses on my examinee's view. And the reason for that is that if you're testing an examinee who has difficulty with the iPad or difficulty tapping or has a motor impairment, they can still respond orally to the items by just naming the letter, the answer choices that go, the letters that go with the answer choices. So if they want to say like B and C, that allows you to tell what the correct answers are quickly, and you can then either score, click your correct or your incorrect button to score the item as correct or incorrect. So there is definitely some flexibility on these kinds of items for either letting the platform score them or taking over and scoring them manually if you need to or if you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. This is block rotation.
You will watch a short video, and then I will ask you to solve some puzzles. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Look at these 5 drawings that are made up of blocks. All of these drawings have the same number of blocks. Now look at these 2 drawings. They are the same as the drawing inside the box, but they have been turned. These 3 drawings are not the same as the drawing inside the box.
Tap the 2 drawings that are the same as the drawing inside the box. Remember that all the drawings have the same number of blocks and they can be turned. If you want to change your answer, tap the drawing again. That is correct. Drawings C and E. Now you're going to do some more of these. For each one, tap the 2 drawings that are the same as the drawing inside the box. Remember that a drawing may be the same as the one inside the box, but it may look different because it's been turned. Go ahead.
The next test I want to show you is called semantic word retrieval, and this is one of the 2 tests that are in the retrieval category. So on these tests, the examiner reads an oral prompt, and then the examinee has 1 minute to say as many words as they can. And for each of these tests, each of these tests has 4 of those items. So the examiner keeps track of the correct responses by clicking a counter button once for each correct word that the examinee says. And on this video, the things I want you to kind of watch out for are the counter interface. So notice how there's like a little plus and minus sign. And so that's the mechanism that I use to score the responses. Every time the examinee says a correct word, I'm going to click the plus button. This examinee doesn't actually say any incorrect words or repeat any words, but if he did, I would skip that word and not click the plus sign. And if I accidentally click the plus sign too many times, I can use the minus button to adjust the score. So that minus button is actually not used for an incorrect response. It's only used when you have to make an adjustment to your score. And if you watch the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to see the count of correct words increase as each time that I hit the plus button. Also notice that the timer running on the top ribbon, you'll see that when the timer gets close to 0, I get a little notice that the time is almost up, and that's just nice so I don't like lose track, and so that when the item is over, I can tell the examinee to stop. One of the hardest parts about giving the retrieval tests in paper is that sometimes you don't catch everything the examinee says. So especially if they're going really fast, like at the very beginning, they might just be naming off words really fast, and you're trying to quickly acknowledge those words and score them, make decisions about scoring them. as fast as they're talking. And so this is a test where the audio capture actually can come in very handy on the digital platform. So I would score this test in real time as the examiner's taking the test, as examinee is taking the test. But because I'm letting the platform capture an audio recording of the entire test, if I miss something or if I think I might have misscored something, I can always go back later and listen to the recording to check that I counted the right number of words. Okay, so here goes semantic word retrieval.
I want you to tell me all the different things you can think of that you can eat or drink. You will have 1 minute to name as many as you can. When I say begin, say the words as quickly as you can. Begin.
Cheeseburger, milkshake, Coke, veggies, carrots, broccoli, candy, water, lemonade, fruit punch, Cheez-Its, popcorn, protein bar, donuts, coffee, coffee cake,
Stop.
Next, I want to show you an example of the scored elements test type. So this category only includes 3 tests. In reading recall and story recall, the examinee hears a story or reads a story, and then they retell that story orally, and the examiner has to listen to their retelling and mark the elements that the examinee correctly recalls. For oral reading, it's kind of the opposite. The examinee reads a story, and the examiner marks the words that they read incorrectly or skip. So in that test, they're actually marking errors and not correct responses. So the test I'm going to show you is story recall, and the interface for these is a really close approximation of the administration in paper. The improvement in the digital platform is that the examiner no longer has to count the number of correct elements on each story and then decide whether to go forward or backward. So the platform does all the score summing for you, but you still just need to keep track of the elements. In this video, note that when I click on an element to mark it as correct, it turns green, and then the running score on the bottom of the screen goes up each time I click on one of those elements. Like the other tests you've seen, the audio recorded prompt is integrated right into the test interface. So this is really helpful on a test like this where the examinee may need to go back and take earlier stories. So if they don't do well on the first story, the platform may route them backwards. And in that case, you would need to make sure that in the paper, you'd have to make sure that you skipped back to the correct place on the audio recording. But on the digital platform, you don't have to do that. You're always going to have the audio for the story right there with the story. Like the semantic word retrieval test that you just saw, it's useful for these scored elements tests that you can go back later and listen to the audio capture in case you think you might have missed a word or misscored something the first time. Especially on story recall and reading recall, these are tests where there are some nuanced rules about when an element is considered correct or incorrect. And so, don't worry about it if you don't score it exactly perfectly in the moment, because you can always go back later, listen to it again, read the scoring instructions, and just confirm that you did indeed score it correctly, or adjust the score if you need to. So this is story recall.
You are going to hear a story from your speaker. First, you will hear a beep. Then the story will begin. When the story is over, you will hear 2 beeps. Then you tell the story back to me. You do not have to say the story exactly the same. Just tell me everything you can remember.
Rick got some glow-in-the-dark stars for his 6th birthday. He wanted to put them on his bedroom ceiling.
Rick got some stars that glow in the dark. He wanted to put them on his ceiling.
The last clip I'm going to show you is from the new rapid letter naming test. There are 5 of these RAN tests on the WJ5, and they all use this interface design. They're actually probably the tests that are the most different in terms of how you administer them and how the interface looks from all of the other tests on the battery. And so in this test, the examinee sees rows of numbers or letters on the iPad, and they have 1 minute to read them as fast as they can. A few of the things that I want to note about this test. So first, notice how, like on some of the other tests, when I roll my cursor over the examinee's view of my screen, my mouse arrow is going to turn into a pointer, and then the examinee is seeing that pointer on their iPad. Also notice that when the examinee is reading the letters, that I'm just taking my cursor and just following along in the scoring interface. And this way, my pointer is right where it needs to be if the examinee makes an error. So this examinee doesn't actually make any mistakes, but if he did, I would just simply click on the letter that he says wrong to mark it as an error, and then I would keep going. So the scoring is, it happens very quickly, and you have to really keep your cursor. This is, again, one of those reasons that we recommend not using a trackpad and using a mouse instead, because this is a much easier thing to do with a mouse. Also, that notice that when the examinee gets to the end of each screen, that I don't move my cursor down to the arrow to advance to the next screen. And you can't really see in this video because it's hidden, but I'm just clicking the N key on my keyboard, which is a shortcut that's built into the platform for advancing to the next screen. This test is really, these 5 tests are probably the only place that it's really essential that you be using that N key, simply because the time that it takes you to move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen to advance the screen in between each item set is actually being included in the examinee's testing time. So using the N key allows you to advance the screen very quickly, and you're not, penalizing the examinee for how long it takes you to use your mouse. Something else I want you to watch out for, and that is on the examinee's view panel of my screen. Notice that each time I flip to a new screen, the background color of that screen changes. It goes from light gray to dark gray and back to light gray. And the reason that is because the examinee really needs a visual cue to know that the screen is advanced. Otherwise, it's really hard as an examinee when you get to the bottom row. If you don't have that visual cue that a new screen pops up, you're not going to know that you need to start back at the top of the page again. So that's just a design element that's really built in to keep the test flowing well. And at the end of this test, you're going to see that when I say stop, there's going to be a box that pops up, and that box tells me to click the last letter on that screen that the examinee named. And this is the mechanism that ensures that the examinee gets credit for a partially completed screen when the timer runs out. So if the examinee is on the second or the middle of the second row or starting on the third row and the timer ends, we want to make sure that they're getting credit for all of the things that they did name on that screen. And so that box just tells you as the examiner to tell the platform what was the last thing that they said. And then you'll see a follow-up box that asks whether they answered any items incorrectly that weren't clicked during the timer. And that's, again, just if the timer goes off right when they're saying an incorrect response, you have a mechanism for marking that response as incorrect in the platform. So there's lots of stuff happening on this test, but it's actually relatively simple to administer. So I'm going to go ahead and show you.
Tell me the names of these letters as fast as you can.
T, P, A, S, B, E.
Now you are going to see more rows of letters. Start with the first row and tell me the names of the letters as fast as you can until you finish. Are you ready?
Yes.
Go ahead.
B, A, E, S, P, T, P, A, S, E, P, T, S, E, A, B, T, A, S, T, P, E, S, B, P, S, B, E, A, S, B, E, P, T, B, A, T, E, S, E, T, P, A, B, S, T, B, A, P, E, P, A, B, T, B, P, E, A, S. A, B, P.
And stop.
All of these different interfaces were designed and had been built on the platform. The next task was for the content team to adapt the instructions from all of the paper versions of these tests so that they would match the interface. And this was actually a much bigger task than you can imagine. So, for example, everywhere that the instructions told the examiner to turn the page, that needed to be rewritten to tell the examiner to advance to the next screen or advance to the next item. And where the instructions told the examiner to score a response as correct or incorrect, it needed to be rewritten to tell the examiner to select the examinee's response from the answer key. So this is just one example here on the screen of kind of a side-by-side or a top and bottom of the instructions from one test that had to be completely rewritten. On the top, you see sentence reading fluency. This is basically the introduction to the live items of the test. And this is from the paper version on the top. And then down below, you can see the digital version. And so you can just see, first of all, you can see that we've gotten rid of all the pointing instructions from the paper version, which is nice, makes it a lot easier to administer. But you also just see that, the references to pointing to opening the response booklet, pointing to things in the test booklet, all of that is now changed because of the digital interface. So all of these instructions had to be rewritten, every single test, and in some cases, item by item instructions had to be rewritten. Final step in the content adaptation was to write the logic for how the platform guides the user through the test. So as you've seen, the platform handles most of the decision making that users had to handle by themselves in the paper versions. So all of that logic had to be written very explicitly, covering all different possible scenarios of starting points, navigation through the test, and stopping rules. And the way that we documented this was through the use of what we called logic maps. So a logic map is really just a diagram that shows how the test routes examinees based on their starting age or grade, and then their performance on the test items. So this example is from nonsense word reading. And you can see here that all the examinees begin this test with introduction 1, and then everybody takes sample item A. If they get the first trial of sample item A correctly, then they'll jump over to sample item B trial 1. If they answer incorrectly on sample item A trial 1, they're going to get a second trial or a second trial of sample item A. And then they'll go to sample item B. So you can see here that this just maps out the logic for that. Once everybody has taken sample item A and B, then regardless of their performance on those items, they're routed to an age or grade specific starting point. And then once they've entered the test at that starting point, they're going to use basal and ceiling rules to test forward or backward to obtain both a basal and a ceiling. So the platform had to be smart to lots of different, real use cases. So for example, if you started at intro 3 here, which is a starting point for grades 2 to 6, and the examinee did not get a basal, the platform has to know that, and it has to be able to know how many items it has to jump back to, continue testing to try to get a basal. The other thing that had to be accounted for here was if an examiner were to go in and change an item score. So once an item has been administered, as I told you earlier, you can go back and change it if the examinee changes their response or self-corrects. Doing that can sometimes, break a basal, meaning, maybe you had 5 in a row correct and now you've changed one of them to incorrect. And so now you no longer have a basal. So all of that logic had to be built in so that the platform at any given time during the test would know which item it needs to go to next and would be able to, to sort of finish the test in a valid way so that the score string would be valid and scoreable from that administration. So this is just an example of logic map. Some of the logic maps were much more complicated than this one. This is a very simple one. Tests that are administered in stories or blocks typically have a much more complex logic map because they have to be able to jump back and forth through lots of different kinds of scenarios. I think we're coming to the end of our time today, but if you've stayed with me this far, I just really want to thank you for attending. I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the digital platform and also just hearing about some of the planning and thought that went into it. There's just, there's so many details, and I think it's hard to really understand and comprehend just the amount of planning and work that went into this adaptation. So there's so many more things I'd love to show you, and unfortunately we just don't have any more time, but I do recommend that if you have the time that you go to Riverside's website and you check out some of the other webinars. You're going to be able to get some more of the features and some more about the tests themselves, and also about scores and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that there. And then once you have your login credentials, if you go to the resources tab on the platform, you're going to find a lot of informational videos and quick start guides there as well. So I just want to thank the CAI and Riverside for inviting me here today. I'm super happy to use the time we have left to answer any questions. Thanks again for attending.